Welcome everyone. I hope everyone can hear and see us, and welcome to the second session of the NERI Labour Market Conference. And the session titled today is Precarious Work and Policy Responses. So we have 5 presentations here today covering a broad range of areas. And as we are 5 in this session, it would be great to kind of get things underway. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Pablo Rojas Coppari, who's a migration advisor at the OSCE, also previously of Maynooth University. And his presentation today is how Ireland's labour regime entraps migrants in households in hyper-precarity. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work. I hope this is. Is this working? Yeah, now it is. So maybe just by way of starting, I just wanted to remind or like to mention that my piece of research, it actually comes out of my doctorate that was approved by faculty just last week. It's a qualitative piece of research which focuses on the experience of precarity of migrant households in the Irish labour market, and focuses also on the agency and strategies that they use to minimize precarity. Unfortunately, because of the time constraint, I'm not going to be able to really dwell into the qualitative part of it. That's why I left a couple of quotes in the presentation for people who are going to be looking at the presentation at a later stage online, etc. So mainly, like these are the research questions of my research. So is to the extent to which labour migrants experience precarity trapped in Ireland, and the extent to which Irish government policy has been responsible for and responsive to labour migrants' experience of precarity, and what are the impact of precarity on migrants' agency, decision-making, and their family life and sense of belonging. Today, I'm only going to be able to focus on the central question because of the time constraints. Before moving on I would like to tell a little bit about the methodology. So this research was done in conjunction between the Maynooth University and the Migrant Rights Centre Ireland as part of the IRC employment-based program. Overall, as I said already, it's a piece of qualitative research. It focused on labour market trajectories using as sort of applying a life course model over the career paths of labour migrants in Ireland. And the goal of the research was to shift away from like studies of individualized labour market characteristics and how that affects their integration in the labour market, to looking at it from a household perspective and looking at it from the barriers that policy and different social regimes, including social welfare regimes, impose on their ability to avoid or exit precarity. So as I said, my sampling was it's focused on labour migrants. So I mean those who entered Ireland with a work permit between 1999 and 2004. The period that I focus on is also before the enlargement of the EU, to be able to sort of understand the impact of the EU enlargement in their careers, in their labour market trajectories. And to start with, I used a descriptive quantitative analysis of a data set of the MRCI, which has over 18,000 files of people who access their case management service. And that helped me sort of decide on 2 sectors of employment to look into: accommodation and food services, which represented the largest sector where work permits were issued during that period, and domestic and work care, where it's a sector where the highest proportion of non-EU migrants in the Irish labour market, and also has a very specific gender characteristic, which was part of like what I wanted to study. There were 49 interviews, of which 41 were labour migrants and 8 were adult family members. And the average length of stay was, at the time of the interviews, 15 years. And the gender, you see gender desegregation there, 26 women, 15 men. And by the time that I was doing the interview, 25 out of them would have already been naturalized, and 13 would have been acquired full residency. I don't have time to contextualize the immigration in Ireland or like the economy during that period, but I assume that you're all very familiar with it. I just wanted to give a brief introduction about the work permit system, which continues to be the main and only labor migration system in Ireland. It is very much akin to a guest worker model in the sense that it is temporary in nature. It was the main entry category to Ireland before 2004. After, of course, there's been the EU enlargement and that changed a lot, but still continues to be the only way that non-EU migrants can come in and be formally recognized as labor migrants. And the important things about the work permit system is there is no mobility. You cannot change employers. And you have to reapply for a new work permit. You risk termination of employment and loss of immigration status. And there is very, very limited access to social protection regime for workers, and there's not at all access for dependents. And things such as family reunification and long-term residency were only introduced at a much later stage condition in many ways and in non-statutory basis, which of course, so that covers a long period of time of the participants after their arrival to Ireland. So, I mean, as part of like my research argues is that labor migrants in Ireland experience hyper-precarity, which is advanced by the theory of Lewis and Waite. But what I try to argue is that the experiences of precarity of labor migrants are significantly different from that of other precarious workers in Ireland, and including those who we define as having precarious lives. And that's because labor migrants concentrate on precarious employment, as we know, but also because, and they have precarious migrant status, and precarious migrant status being one where there's very limited access to permanency or none, but also where there irregularization, so falling out of the system is very common, but also gives people very limited social rights. And so my argument is that the intersection of precarious employment and precarious migrant status gives birth to this concept of hyper-precarity, which means that there's very limited choices for labor migrants to exit without having severe consequences, either in terms of exploitative employment or in terms of losing their immigration status. So that entraps them in hyper-precarity. There are many indicators that I use in my thesis, but for today I'm just going to focus on 3 ones, which are interconnected and which I argue that the labor migration system and the intersection with the social welfare regime help participants get stuck in that. So the first one is exploitation, labor exploitation. And so just to give an example, they're manifest in 2 specific ways: exploitative recruitment, which means that they have to acquire debt or pay agency fees or recruitment fees, which disadvantages from the outset. So 15 out of like 41 participants experience exploitative recruitment, and 25 out of 41 participants experience exploitative employment as defined as below the conditions of employment law. So you see it's a high significant. And the second element that I associate with the labor migration regime in Ireland is irregularity. So people becoming undocumented, of which 19 out of 41, so almost half of them, experience irregular status at some point in their life in Ireland, including 3 of them which were still at risk, meaning that they haven't acquired any form of permanency. And 12 of those 19 experience irregularity for over a year. The reason why I point that out is because part of like the research finding is that the longer the period of irregularity, the harder it is to get out of experiences of precarity. So it has a lasting effect that goes throughout the years. And finally, the third indicator here is low pay. And I think both experiences of exploitation and experiences of irregularity basically maintain people in low pay much longer than when they already have resolved some of the previous issues. So in total, currently at the time of the interview, 24 participants were still in low pay. 39 out of the 41 were affected by low pay at some point in their careers or in their trajectories, including 26 of which who never experienced an employment which was not considered low paid. And 28 out of the 41 had experienced more of like half of their time in Ireland receiving low pay. So, I mean, obviously, as I said, all these 3 indicators together with a couple of others that I don't have the time to discuss today, are interconnected. And my argument is that the labor migration system actually helps to entrap them in these experiences of precarity. Why? Because the labor migration system in Ireland reduces mobility in the labor market, so that, and thus entraps them in jobs that offer low pay only and that experience exploitation. The labor migration system in Ireland also exposes them to irregularity, meaning that like they're a constant risk or a fear of irregularity, which limits what the exit voice capability, which is the theory of Hirschman. So basically saying that they can't exit the exploitative employment without having consequences on their labor market trajectory and on their lives, such as losing their status. And if they voice their discontent, they are very likely to actually be reimposed a penalty, be it by losing their job and losing their status, or being imposed even more difficult conditions of employment. So their exit voice capabilities are reduced to a minimum. And finally, because the labor migration system in how it intersects with the social protection regime by limiting their access to it, and also has imposes barriers to family reunification. I can't go into detail now, but it basically makes it very hard for people to family reunify. And when they do manage to reunify, dependent access to the labor market is restricted and pushes them into inactivity, which results in the whole one income earn model, further compelling the precarity. So these are my concluding reflections. It's like, which are sort of like policy advice. So access to social protection regime needs to be extended to all labor markets, not only to independents, to not only limit the effects of hyper-precarity, but also to ensure labor market integration of migrant households. The labor migration regime requires urgent reform to incorporate mobility both within sectors and across sectors, so allowing people to move types of jobs within, like, let's say, the restaurant sector, but also for people to be able to move out of the restaurant sector into other sectors that they may be qualified for or that may be able to yield better conditions of employment. And the immigration regime also needs to be fully legislated for, particularly to address the constant threat of irregularization. And the final point is in relation to COVID. And of course, my research has been done before the COVID time. COVID has impacted a lot on how we acknowledge and understand precarious employment in Ireland, migrant labor in Ireland, and the role of migrant labor in this essential work. But it has also bring more light about the use of the employment permit system and how the employment permit system continues to be the only labor migration system in Ireland, and whether it can be responsive to the needs of the labor market. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We have actually, and the first question we actually have on that sort of nicely tips into your last point there on in your concluding remarks, in terms of what the impact of COVID is likely to be for those workers. So maybe actually, like, if you want to expand on that thought. I mean, obviously we're very fluid at this point, but what do you think the impact of COVID is going to be for the types of workers you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is important is, like, okay, my research focuses a lot from a historical perspective of people who are, for the most of them, no longer in the work permit system, but they still continue to be precarious workers, and they still continue to work in particular sectors that are very much impacted by COVID, including the accommodation, food sector, and care sector. We particularly saw a lot about the care sector this time. I think while initially you would have expected that there is a lot more recognition of the role that they play in society, which may yield into, like, better employment protections and that. But then, like, unfortunately, the second stage what we saw is that there are still very limited employment protections for other essential workers, like the meat packers and people working in meat factories and mushroom factories. A lot of those who would have entered in the past with work permits, now they may be European citizens, but they still have similar experience of precarity. What is also important to highlight here is that one of the phenomena in the migration system in Ireland over the period of time was the use of the international student system to replace a proper official labor migration system, meaning that a lot of the people who are doing the precarious work that were done by work permits in the past are now being done by international students, which share a lot of this profile with them, meaning the limited access to the labor market, also precarious migrant status, and very, very limited to non-access to social protection.
Very good. Just one more quick question here from Philip O'Connell. Looking, does your research look at the characteristics of exploitative employers?
Employers, actually, I don't not so much. My research really focuses on the experiences of labor migrants and the role of that agencies and strategies are there, but it does give a sort of like a secondary view on the types of employers who use exploitative labor. But that could be, it's a very big range, and I haven't really focused on trying to develop a profile on them. Now, what I have to caution is also, like I said, there's a big historical perspective on this experience of exploitation. While I'm not trying to say that exploitation doesn't happen in Ireland anymore, it happens in a different way. It doesn't mean it's better or worse, it's just different. So particularly because the misuse of the work permit system in the past was very much out there, whereas now I think exploitative employment happens in a more hidden way because there are more controls, labor inspections, etc., things that didn't happen before. So the profile of employers, while I can't say that from my research, I can assume that the profile of the exploitative employers have also changed, and they have to be a bit more cautious in how they exploit people.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much for that, and good questions as well. So without further ado, so I keep to my time here, we're going to, thank you very much, Pablo. We're going to hand over to Dr. Alicja Bobek, who is with the GeoFin research project in Trinity College, previously working in task on issues of working conditions, precarious work, and the title of her presentation today is Precarious Work and Precarious Lives, the Role of Luck, Chance and Social Connections. So if I could get Alicja.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
And I'll try to share the screen.
Yeah, oh, something's happening now, yeah.
All right, can you see me? Yeah.
We can see and hear you, and we can see your presentation there.
Very good. So should I start now, yeah?
Yep, you go for it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so the title of my presentation today is Precarious Work and Precarious Lives, the Role of Luck, Chance and Social Connections. And I think it will actually link very well with Pablo's presentation, although this one is focused not on migrants, but on middle-class precarious workers. So it's based on two projects that I've done along with James Wickham, who is in the room with us, and the second project also with Dr. Sinéad Pembroke. The first project was working conditions in Ireland. Both were actually conducted in task. And the working conditions in Ireland took place between 2015 and 2016 and was focused on interviews with trade union representatives and 40 workers from 4 sectors: construction, hospitality, finances, and ICT. What we looked at was how the recession changed employment relationship and working conditions, but also how the recovery then had an impact on it. And one of the really striking findings was the increased flexibility of employment, but not really like it was before, that it was flexibility on an employee's terms, but rather so-called enforced flexibility. In other words, a growing importance of temporary contracts, zero-hour contracts, self-employment, in a way where people are being told that that's the only option, not really their choice. And from that project and those findings, what we were informed by that project was how those employment conditions actually impact then people's lives. In other words, it's not just employment, it's other areas of lives that are impacted by the contractual situation. That could be housing, could be family formation, but all sorts of kind of planning for the future. Because if you have precarious contract or flexible contract, you can't really plan for either next week, next month, or next year, depending on the nature of the contract. So we focused on so-called objective precarity, which would be irregular part-time work, fixed-term contracts, and self-employment, and the consequences for other aspects of life. And we interviewed stakeholders and again, 40 precarious workers. The sample had been skewed towards people with higher education, which actually produced very interesting findings, and as I will tell you in a minute, because what we found was that the traditional careers for people with third-level educations in some sectors are actually becoming more difficult to obtain. And I also did some analysis of the existing statistical data from the QNHS and the census data. So just to give you a little bit of a background here, precarious work, if you look at the literature, precarious work usually is defined in opposition to standard employment, but the focus of the literature still remains on the erosion of permanent employment for manual workers and for service workers. So the bottom of the labor market, and the jobs that are usually low paid and basically casual work. The other thing that features in the literature is the emphasis on younger workers. So basically, yes, you do have precarious work as a student, but then as you progress, as you, let's say, graduate, your next job would be better and you will eventually get the permanent contract. But what we found in our interviews, both with trade unions and with the workers, is this sort of demand for flexibility where fixed-term contracts and own-account work is more prevalent now in such sectors as financial sector, ICT, but also third-level education, for example. That's very popular way of employing people at the moment, some fixed-term contracts. So people are being told that basically, yeah, you can get work, but it's only 11 months contracts or 2-year contract. But interestingly, it's not only that it's the middle-class jobs that are being casualized, it's the other way around. The casual work is being professionalized as well. So, for example, in early years education, which is basically, like before it was called childcare sector, now it's early years education, and people are pretty much required to have at least level 5 and completed before they start working in a creche. So basically, you need to have third-level education for a lot of work that is actually not that stable. And the second thing is that it's not necessarily a stepping stone. So what we found was that there are really challenging paths to traditional employment in some occupations. So it's no longer the thing that you're just precarious in your 20s, but by your 30s, it becomes different. You're precarious even in your late 30s or 40s. One thing I want to just mention here is the difficulty with statistics. So I will show you in a second a couple of graphs, but workers are very often not aware of their contractual status. So people don't know that they're on temporary contract. They think they're all on 12-month contract and think that they have a permanent job, which they don't. So just to flag out that yes, people with third-level education will have precarious contracts because there is more people with third-level education in the workforce. And also the type of work had been changing. So the gray here is the tertiary education, and I just want to highlight the growing share of third-level education amongst people with own account work and temporary employment, which suggests this the erosion of the traditional career. Brings me to the next point. So within the traditional career, let's say in a bank or in a proper company, the quite important thing was that had other consequences for other aspects of life. So that had implications for housing, tenure, family formation, retirement, health. They were all pretty much connected with employment and also quite often benefits offered by the employer. With flexible career, the precarization of employment comes with other consequences. So there is this whole notion of boundaryless career where people are perceived as wanting this flexible employment, but actually the lack of predictability is problematic here because not only financial but also contractual. So then that comes with, for example, difficulties in accessing mortgage or struggles with the rental market. And what we found is also quite striking with the delay in family formation. So basically, people are postponing having children until they get a permanent job, and that's especially for women. So there's this question between choices and the difference between choices and versus constraints, and the importance of then luck and fortune for precarious workers as opposed to their own kind of hard work. And that brings me to the next point, is how I'm trying to frame that, or for a paper I'm working on at the moment, is how to frame the career and precarious career within the model of the life course examination. So the importance of employment pathways as linked with other stepping stones and other pathways of life and life outcomes, and how it actually links with the whole individualization of life course. Because as you can see here, in traditional professional careers context, if you link together education, career, family status, and housing tenure, they're all linear. So, you know, you'd go from childhood through education, first job, occupational career, and retirement. But that was linked with, let's say, when during your childhood in school, you live with your parents, but then you move to share with friends, renting with partner, and house ownership, and maybe downsizing in the end. But as I argue here, it is actually no longer there for those in precarious employment. Sorry, because at this point where you're supposed to move to the actual traditional career model, the career becomes fragmented. So there is a problem. Do you have children? And how do you actually, especially in our housing market, how do you have your housing arrangements? Is it renting, or maybe moving back with your parents? So I don't think I have time to really go through those quotes, but I will leave them here for people to maybe then check them online. What was very important here was the importance of luck, chance, and any kind of social connections. So in precarious careers as such, people quite often overemphasize not their own efforts and their own building up this, you know, intelligent career, but rather how things happen by a chance, that they were working for somebody who offered them something else, who you met at the conference, or you met at the meeting with friends or something like that. So not really efforts, but luck and a chance. And that relates to career, but it also relates to other aspects of life. So the funniest quotes were kind of sad as well, but striking, where women were saying, "I'm so lucky to have my husband because he has a permanent job." So the importance of partner who has permanent employment was quite prevalent there in the interviews, especially in the context of mortgage or having children. So yeah, just to conclude, the whole notion about the traditional versus flexible career and the choice. So are the choices or are the traps? And the increase of non-standard work, how does it have constraints on people's lives? And then how the life course becomes dependent basically on luck and coincidence and not really choice. Okay. So that's all. I hope I'm on time, am I?
Yep, you're grand. You're just about 2 minutes remaining. Yep.
All right, cool. So yeah, so just to give you the links to our publications here. So there is the enforced flexibility that's from the first project, the working conditions in Ireland, and then social implications of precarious work. They're both available on Task website and in PDF. So if you're interested, especially that this presentation would have more details in the living with precarious, the social implications of precarious work. We also have a paper in recent housing studies about the precarious work and the implications for housing. All right, so thank you. That's all from me, and thanks.
Perfect. First question there is asking what impacts do you think that COVID will have on precarious work in the professions. I'm thinking quite of maybe the practice of working from home. Do we see that maybe increasing the precarious nature in those professions?
I deliberately left that out because I was hoping to on this. I think it's I didn't think about working from home, to be honest, but it's another study, I'd say, to be done on it. But I'm just even thinking from the being employed in Trinity when we got an email about temporary contracts that are not being renewed, for example. So I was wondering then, how does it translate to other professions? So, you know, with a permanent job, even if you're being laid off temporarily, you got the COVID payment or the employment subsidy or something like that. Now, if you were, and it was a specific email from HR saying that if your contract is not being renewed because of COVID, you're not entitled to COVID payment because you didn't lose your job because of COVID, because your temporary contract had been done to an end. So I wonder, you know, if there was a promise of, in other industries, promise of extending contracts that didn't happen, it doesn't entitle you to COVID payment because your contract basically was fixed term, it ended.
Yeah.
Which I think that, you know, with a lot of uncertainty that employers have now, how many people will not have their contract renewed? With working from home, you know, that's another thing, because a lot of precarious workers, they don't have a luxury of having a home office because they're renting with 5 other people. And you can see that even walking around the city, like, you know, people's bedrooms are being polluted with computer screens, which is not a great situation. But I also wonder then, you know, with working from home, to what extent pressures come from employers, because that was another thing that really featured in the interviews. It's the self-pressure, but the pressure from employers. If you're on temporary contract, it's like being self-employed, you're building your own career. So you have to be constantly on. And then the demands are higher because you basically rely on references for the next job.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's another project there, you know.
I was just going to say, yeah, that thing about contracts just coming to an end and it not being linked to COVID. The other question is from the start of the presentation, it was interesting you were talking about the idea of the professionalization of casual work, and you mentioned childcare, and I was wondering in terms of the gender dimension there, that in that regard, are we seeing, is it more in areas where there's more female workers, where that trend is occurring? Because obviously childcare is one of those areas where we now consider it to be a very highly professional service, but we pay it like we used to value it when it was discriminated because it was gendered work.
Yeah, and the same, I agree here, the same with care work. I haven't done that much on it. It's actually another paper that I'm trying to do now about the kind of the 2 ways to precarity. One is the casualization of professional work, and the other one looking specifically at childcare, the professionalization of, did I say the right? Yeah, that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then the professionalization of the casual work. It's actually interesting that you mentioned that. I think that there is an important gender element there. And it's the same for care work, but I think that as opposed to childcare, care work now has more share of males working in it, especially because it's, you know, it's a very physically demanding. But I wonder then, you know, kind of longer term, would the professionalization also mean that the gender balance would change over time? But yeah, it's something that I only started looking into it. Yeah.
No, very interesting stuff there. There's if you see in the questions, there's a comment there, but I'll actually have to leave it just there for you to have a view at it, because I'm going to move on swiftly to the next presentation there, and we are moving swiftly on to Professor James Wickham from Trinity College Dublin. James, if you can you start your
ready to share screen? Yeah.
Your share screen there. I'll let you go away at it so you can get as much time as possible. Ready when you are.
Okay, just hold on. You should be able to screen to share coming up. Okay, you seeing it all right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Right. This covers very much the same ground. But okay. This presentation is about precarious work and family formation in Ireland, some results from Task's Social Implications of Precarious Work project. It's a paper which I'm presenting, but actually a lot of the material and a lot of the ideas come from Alicja and from Sinéad. So I'm really just at the cobbling together some stuff. The idea behind the social implications of work project was that we wanted, first of all, we wanted to unbundle precarity. Precarity is a term that is thrown around a lot, and we wanted to look at different forms of precarity, rather than assuming that precarity has the same implications for right the way across. The second thing that we wanted to do was that we wanted to put precarious work in its context, and this meant looking at the impact of precarious work. And the argument here is that the impact of precarious employment is very much moderated by the form of the welfare state. So some of the consequences of precarious work.
James, just to interrupt you there slightly. If you want to put your PowerPoint there at full screen or whatever, it's just coming up in the.
Oh, sorry, I've got it the wrong way around. Okay, bear with me 1 second. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
You got it now? You should have it.
No, I think you're going to have to maybe choose the screen that you've shared. Maybe you've shared the wrong screen.
I might have shared the wrong screen. I'm sorry about this, people. Okay. How about that one?
There we are.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Two basic hypotheses. The impact of precarious employment is moderated by the welfare state. And secondly, that the experience of precarious employment is moderated by household and life course context. Okay, we now have another technical problem. Okay, on we go. I'm sorry, yeah, okay, I think we're all right now. So the first thing we need to do is to define precarious work, because precarious work is often treated as being the same as low-paid employment. It's often treated as being the same as non-standard employment. And looking purely in terms of the employment relationship and the employment contract, I think it's very important to be clear that low-paid employment is not the same thing as precarious work. They overlap a lot, but they're not the same thing. Equally, equally regular part-time work. It is maybe low paid. It's certainly non-standard. It was in fact the first form of non-standard work to come to people's attention back in the 70s. But it's absolutely not the same thing as precarious work. I keep having a technical problem. Hold on. Okay. So for the study that Alicja was mentioning, the social implications of precarious work, we designed our sampling matrix to look at, to be defined by two dimensions. First of all, the employment, slightly different to the previous screen, but we differentiate between part-time irregular hours, self-employment with no employees, where the possibility of bogus self-employment exists, and fixed term or temporary employment. And the other dimension is to look at the household context. We look for people who are single, or people who are single with child or children, people who are in a relationship, and people who are in a relationship with children. That produced a sampling matrix, and we purposely sampling until we reach saturation of 40 people. As Alicja mentioned, we tended to be over representative of people with higher education. And I was going to talk about the relationship between education and precarious work, but I'm actually going to jump all of this. The basic point that kept coming out in the interviews is that the aspiration of our interviewees, in particular those in, if you like, what we're beginning to call the lower service class, is for wanting a proper job. So there's a lot of, there always has been a lot of rhetoric around the place from management consultants in particular about how young people today don't want boring old-fashioned jobs. People want portfolio careers, etc., etc. What was striking about our interviewees was the extent to which people wanted what they referred to as a proper job. This is one quote here, for example, which gives you the flavor of that. So it is absolutely not the case that there are people quite happily moving from one job to another as a matter of choice. Sorry, it's quite clear there are people like that, but they are, I would have thought, a minority. The dominant experience of people is a frustration of the aspiration for a, quote, proper job. Now, it's in that context that we started looking at the social implications of precarious work. And we looked at 3 different areas. We looked at housing, we looked at health, and in both of those we have papers either written, published or hopefully being under review at the moment. And the third thing that I want to talk about, which is fertility and demography and family formation. Now, you're probably all well aware that there's this argument that Europe is suffering from a fertility crisis, that women are not having enough children, that the population will start declining, etc., etc. And bizarrely, one major argument for immigration has become the baby deficit, not the baby deficit, sorry, the declining fertility of the indigenous population. I say bizarre because it's quite a strange connection of different sets of arguments. Now, most conventional understandings of declining fertility link this to lifestyle choices and individual decisions. Smaller families, postponed parenthood, and childlessness are all seen as lifestyle decisions. So there's a classic run of papers on that. However, there is evidence, which has been growing since the turn of the century, that what is remarkable about Europe is the extent to which people do not have as many, women do not have as many children as they would like to have. The baby deficit is one where people say, yes, we'd like to have children, but we can't. We can't, as in, we feel we're not able to yet because of our, usually what comes up is because of our employment. We're not ready, and we'd like to. Now, this seems to be fairly clear this is, it does seem to be linked, first of all, to unemployment and uncertainty. It's also particularly the case in Southern Europe, this decline in fertility, which has been endemic in Southern Europe, but is now linked to in the growth of insecure and temporary, and above all, temporary employment amongst young people. The interesting sort of complicating factor in the argument is the role of the welfare state, because one of the things that some welfare states do, of course, is they don't just provide education; they provide preschool education and childcare. Seems to be the case, though it's unclear as yet. There are some interesting papers which compare, for example, France and Italy. And it seems that the extent of childcare and preschool education in France, which has been long-standing, incidentally, means to say that the direct effect of precarious employment isn't there, whereas it is a very strong, as I've already said, in Italy. Okay, so here's, for example, an interview quote, which brings out this one. One of our interviewers saying, my cousin is a year younger than me. She's already had a child. She's trying to get a second child. She was getting IVF, and IVF, she had got pregnant. So I know from around me and from my family that it's very difficult to do that. Yet I think after 2 years, by the time I'm 37, I probably won't even be able to, I've never been able to consider it. It's really challenging because I don't know where I'm going to be in 2 years' time. And I don't know if things continue the way they are, job-wise, it means I won't be able to have a child. So women are increasingly put in this situation where they delayed having children. They're still in temporary and precarious employment,
James,
and so nothing has changed.
You've got 2 minutes there.
That's good. We're on the penultimate slide. Now, we've been talking obviously about women, but what is, I thought, rather intriguing coming out from some of our interviews is that this obviously involves men. It involves men, firstly, in the simple sense that there is pressure on the man to have a regular job. And if he doesn't have a regular job and is not providing, he's not able to provide that certainty, in this case, the wife is very clear, we're not going to be in a family situation until we're properly settled, which means having a job. Interestingly, we did find cases where it works the other way around, where because the man couldn't get a secure job, but the woman did have a secure job, that created a situation where he would be able to deal with childcare. So his precarious employment was actually, if you like, legitimated him taking over the home care role. Right, so we end. As I've already said, management consultancy arguments are that young people want flexibility, but the aspiration for a proper job is still widespread. A proper job is often seen as precondition for having children, especially in this area, which I didn't have time to talk about, which we might call the lower service class or the lower professional class. And intriguingly, and finally I leave you with this thought, there seem to be feedback loops between precarity and the household context. In other words, if you are in precarious employment, your household situation is precarious, but that they may make it more difficult for you to get a regular employment. And we've seen that operating to some extent in the housing area and also in the health area. So precarity doesn't just have consequences, it affects back onto the household situation. Right, thank you very much, that's it.
That's great, James. Unfortunately, we only have time for one question because we're running a little bit over. But I think it kind of relates to 2 points that were made in your presentation when you were discussing permanent or proper jobs and with regard to precarious work, and then in terms of family formation, it being termed as a lifestyle choice. Do you think a big problem we have is with language around these things, that people say, oh yeah, I've chosen not to have children, but in reality, it's an enforced choice because of their employment situation, and that when asking these things, we kind of need to be more careful about language.
Yeah, this is this sort of argument about how we understand people, how we understand people's situation, we as sociologists or researchers understand it, and how people understand themselves. That's a pretty old one. I mean, remember all the arguments about the domestic division of labor, for example, redolent with these controversies. I don't have a glib answer to that. I think what struck us is actually the way, it is important to listen to the way people talk about these things themselves. And as Alicja said, one of the things that's really quite remarkable amongst our interviews is the way in which people deny their own agency. You know, they say luck, coincidence, and whatever. And that's quite interesting because it contrasts with the way in which young people going through education increasingly understand themselves. Because I don't know if you know, Michael Sandel the other day commented that one of the things that he noted amongst his students at Harvard is the way in which they increasingly over the years have understood their success as purely because of their own hard work. Even though nasty sociologists would say, of course, it's precisely the reverse. You know, so we have a situation where I think for the bulk of the population, people are increasingly forced to understand their situations in terms of luck, and chance, not in terms of structural constraints, not in terms of class or inequality, but at the same time amongst the elite groups and in elite discourses which permeate down, where people understand their success in totally individualistic and, if you like, meritocratic terms.
Very good. That's a pretty good answer. Excellent stuff. Okay, thank you very much, James. And I will move on next to our next presentation is from Professor Michael Doherty from the Department of Law at University of Maynooth. And his presentation today is Solving the Gig Saw, Collective Rights and Platform Work. So without further ado, if everything is in working order there, which it appears to be, I will drop off and hand over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Paul. Everything, yeah, there's nothing, the only thing worse than being the person like James for whom it freezes is the next person, because you're just expecting it to happen. But anyway, so thanks very much, everybody. This is a paper that I have recently published with my colleague Valentina Fanca from Slovenia, and the presentation was largely put together by Emma Guyett, who's been working with me. Basically, I am talking about platform work, but essentially everything I'm saying can easily be related to all of the categories of work and workers that have already been mentioned in terms of precarity and precarious work. Certainly in labour law, it's just easier to get things published at the minute if you have gig or platform in the title, so there you go. I'm conscious that this is a very complex area, so when I'm talking about platform work or gig work, essentially here, and there is a bit more discussion of this in the paper obviously, but essentially I'm talking about relatively precarious workers. I'm not talking about IT professionals or people with large power to negotiate terms and conditions. I am talking about people who don't fall neatly into the employee or self-employed category. So typically, the poster children for this are Uber, Deliveroo, partners or riders, depending on the terminology. And essentially, I want to look at how can and should these workers be protected. So basically, I'm going to briefly, please don't leave when you see the word law. It's not going to be very legal, and you have to stay for Mary's presentation, which is proper research in a minute anyway. So I'm going to look briefly at this idea of the personal scope of employment law, who's covered by employment law. Definitely don't leave when you see the word competition law. It's just a very brief point, which leads me on to my argument, which is about the role essentially for the social partners in this sphere. So basically, Employment Law 101, you have two categories. You have employees who are controlled and subordinate to the employer, and you have the self-employed entrepreneurs, independent contractors, whatever terminology is used. The former employees gain protection from labour law, and they also have quite, depending on the country, they have relatively extensive social security rights. The self-employed, on the other hand, tend not to be covered by the same level of labour law protection, nor to have the same entitlements to social protection, because they take the risk in the expectation of getting the reward. So by earning profits, they can buy essentially their protection. At EU level, there is a definition not of employee but of worker, which I've laid out there. It's a long-standing definition. It basically would be broader than the usual definition of employee in the European member states, but it only applies in situations where EU law is invoked. So the classic one is, if I leave Ireland and go to France looking for employment, I am then exercising my European Union free movement rights, and EU law applies, and the definition of worker applies. However, most protective employment legislation that comes from the EU, so that around part-time workers or fixed-term workers, refers to employees and leaves the definition of employees to the national legislature. In some countries, there is an intermediate category. So one solution for these workers for ease of keeping the presentation going, I'll refer to Deliveroo riders as the classic example. So Deliveroo riders, are they employees? The Deliveroo would argue not, that it is just a platform connecting somebody willing to do work with somebody who needs a service. Are they self-employed? Well, they don't always meet the definition of the standard definition of self-employment when we think of, the picture a minute ago was of Steve Jobs, of entrepreneurs and, people who can earn a lot of money by innovating and taking risks and doing all these sorts of things. So in some countries, there have been attempts to find an intermediate category. So 2 examples, the UK and Slovenia, where so the UK, for example, you have the concept of worker. It's a different legal concept. In Slovenia, you have the economically dependent worker. And in both of these situations, the argument is that these are not quite employees, but they should be entitled to more employment law protections than the self-employed. There has been talk of introducing, should we in Ireland introduce this category? Basically, I would say no, for a number of reasons. First, anywhere that this category has been introduced, it's not really seen there as successful. So in Slovenia, Valentina's informed me that a big problem is collusion, effectively, between the worker, the service provider, and the partner, the putative employer, because lower social security obligations can ensue, lower tax rates can ensue, and therefore there's no benefit in some instances to this category. And another argument against this is that, well, if you have a third category, you might have people who might be considered employees downgraded, if you like, into the worker status. So the classic example of this, famous litigation involving Uber drivers in the UK, which is still winding its way through the court system. Uber drivers were classified as workers under European law, under UK law. Personally, I would have thought if that case was taken in Ireland, those same people could have been classified as employees and therefore entitled to greater rights. So it is an option. It's not one that I would prefer, and mainly because of it, you introduce another legal category, you introduce more legal complexity. So what would I prefer? Well, this is where I come to the horrible intersection with competition law. So basically what I'm going to argue for is a model based on a regulatory collective bargaining system on a sectoral basis. There is a problem with collective bargaining and collectivism, with collective bargaining and competition law, which is that collective bargaining is by definition price fixing. I mean, that's what it is. We sometimes refer to collective bargaining as wage cartels. So it's people getting together collectively to fix a wage. And of course, competition or antitrust law is all about preventing cartels and price fixing and so on. So most courts, including the EU court, has developed a kind of an antitrust immunity, that collective agreements can be concluded and they will be valid and they will not fall foul of competition law as long as they involve employees and not self-employed. So explicitly, self-employed workers under European law cannot conclude collective agreements. Recently, there has been a little bit of movement on this in the Court of Justice, which has recognized this category of false self-employed service providers who are in a situation comparable to employees. And this group, if they can be identified, can be covered by collective agreements. So you can have a collective agreement and it's immunized from competition law for employees or the false self-employed, but not for genuine self-employed workers. So that leaves your Deliveroo rider in a slightly awkward position. The platform, Deliveroo, says, well, you're not an employee, so you can't collectively bargain. If the courts decide, or the tax or social security authorities decide you're self-employed, well, then you can't enter into collective agreement. So you might have to establish that you're falsely self-employed, which again is a little bit complex if it involves individual litigation. So there is an Irish solution to this, and it stems out of a long-running dispute, which a lot of people will be familiar with, involving voiceover actors, session musicians, and freelance journalists in Ireland, dating back to the early part of the 2000s, where these groups sought to set minimum rates for their services and were told by the Irish Competition Authority, you can't do that because you're breaching competition law, you're self-employed people and you're price fixing. So eventually in 2017, an act was passed to enable trade unions to apply to bargain collectively on behalf of those specific groups, those three groups mentioned, but also it introduced two new categories of workers into Irish law: the false self-employed, which broadly mirrors the EU court definition, and the fully dependent self-employed, which essentially is somebody who can say, well, I'm not a genuine self-employed worker and I get my income essentially from two sources. The picture there is Scarlett Johansson, who is a voiceover actor, but I guess doesn't fall within our definition of precarious. The important point about the Act, from my point of view, is that it vests the right to protect groups of workers who are not classically employees in trade unions, rather than forcing those people to take individual actions. It's a relatively new law, so we don't really have any test cases yet, but I think the principle is important, that collective representation should not automatically be denied to those who are not traditional employees under the tests we use.
Sorry, Michael, that's your 2-minute warning there, if that's all right.
Yeah, just moving to the last point, which is, so what do we do? Well, I say that there's a big role, I would argue, for the social partners here. So I've made the point already that individual employment rights, even if they're very extensive, are difficult for vulnerable or precarious works to vindicate. So the regulatory role and the sectoral role in particular for trade unions is important. And that's essentially what the 2017 Act is trying to push. What trade unions can do, won't go through the quote, is diffuse employment rights throughout an economy or indeed a sector. And I would argue that a sectoral approach is probably advantageous here. In the paper, we talk a lot about the sectoral employment order system in Ireland, which of course is now under threat, but we would see that as particularly a good sectoral model for this type of bargaining. What about the employers? Just as a last point, the traditional employers, represented by IBEC and so on, have been quite silent in this debate about platform work, generally speaking. I think that's a big mistake, because if platforms or other types of arrangements are being used to evade tax, social security and legislative protections for workers, then that gives the companies that can evade those obligations unfair competitive advantage over others. Platforms, of course, don't engage in social partnership at all, because they say we're not employers, we're just intermediary companies. But we know, and this is documented clearly in the paper, that there's extensive political lobbying by the likes of Uber to get regulatory changes and legislative changes to suit their business model. So I would say, going back to the categorization, it is good to have a broader conception of what the employment relationship involves beyond the traditional employee status, and this applies very significantly in the sphere of social security or protection rights. But I think granting more individual rights to people is never an answer in our type of model. So we need a regulatory collective bargaining model on a, I would argue, sectoral basis, and this should involve employers. So traditional employers should step up to be more vocal in the debate, and disruptive employers should be either encouraged or forced to engage in a role beyond political lobbying. This is not against innovation, it's not against the platform economy, it's trying to ensure that tax and social security contributions to the state are protected in order for decent working conditions to be implemented. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Just one question there in terms of the point you were making about any kind of collective action amongst non-employees. How does that relate to sort of, the classic example of, guilds, or say if you're hiring a welder in a blue book rate, where somebody has had to reach a certain level of qualification? How does the antitrust or competition get around that?
Yeah, I mean, we've, you know, it's not uncommon for rates to be set depending on qualifications and so on. But strictly speaking, you know, those things will always be vulnerable to a court challenge unless they're implemented in primary legislation. And that's what we've seen. So we now have a situation where the court has said electricians are not covered by the order that they thought they were covered by. There's a stay on that. They have contracts which may or may not incorporate that rate. If it does, that's great. But if you're new into the electric game, you may not get that rate. So there is always a threat from this. Of course, it depends on a challenge being taken. And that's probably where, again, I'd be a little bit hard on traditional employers, but I think everybody realizes that the employer representation is fractured in a way, you know, has become increasingly fractured, particularly over the last 20 years, in a way that maybe it wasn't previously. And some employers are delighted with a sectoral system in construction and electrical contracting, some aren't.
Fair enough. Look, thank you very much for that, Michael. And if I can ask Mary Murphy, if you are ready and set there. And Mary's presentation is finally COVID. Yes, looking at a high road era back to work. So Mary, if you're all set to go there, I will drop off.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to thank NERI, because I was supposed to be on tomorrow and you facilitated putting me into this session. And to some degree, I'm a bit left field in this session in what I'm doing, but at the same time, I think it links quite well to the theme of precarious work, and particularly to, as James was saying, the degree to which precarious work is mediated by the kind of welfare state, but also some of the issues people raised about language and framing. I want to also apologise because I haven't really followed my abstract very well, and you'll see why in a second. The reason I didn't follow my abstract very well is I watched the Dublin Economics Labour Market session last week, and I was really curious because I saw the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service and the Labour Market Advisory Council frame the problem that we have at the moment as pandemic unemployment. And it got me just thinking about the framing of things during crisis and how important it is in defining how we understand what the problem is. So last week, in the Dublin Economic session, the problem was very much framed as the people who are either on the pandemic unemployment payment, the temporary work subsidy of the time, or the live register. And we saw various analyses of the trends of what was happening across those three payments. And the kind of conclusion was that we're entering a worrying stage where those still on the pandemic-related income supports, they're younger, they're lower paid, they're likely to be evolving into long-term unemployment. There are worries about the incentive issues they may face in the context of low pay, and I think also in the context of their youth. And the conclusion was that a work-first activation strategy with a good, strong emphasis on carrots and active labour market measures and increased investment, significant increased investment in public employment services and caseworkers was needed, all welcome, but also that there were sticks needed in the form of sanctions. So it was very much a framing of the problem geared at a particular group of people and a particular set of assumptions about what would solve the unemployment problem in the context of the pandemic. And I just felt uncomfortable with some of the analysis, and I got to thinking about just what other ways might there be to frame how we understand the now. And I turned to Braninki. It's a paper that I have with Pauline Cullen in an upcoming Gender Work Organisation article, where we used the idea that there is a feminist framing of crisis that allows you to very differently articulate what the problem is. And what Braninki argues is that what we often see is quite normative assumptions, rationalist kind of crisis management assumptions that are quite utilitarian in their logic, quite masculine, and quite linear. That we see what the problem is, we prepare and prevent it, we get into recovery, we learn from it, and we move on. The assumption is this is a very much a one-off crisis, and our aim is to return to normal. And what Berinke argues is that this really omits sufficient enough analysis of the reality of pre-existing problems that exist independent of and prior to the present crisis that we're examining. And she argues we need to theorise crisis management differently, and that if you ground it in a feminist ethic of care, what you do is you get connective tissue. You really connect up the issues in a broader way and bring in more issues, and you see greater continuity across and relationship between the different types of crises that we have in a continual way and will have into the future. We'll see more intersection of crisis, and that will lead us to realise that we need to focus really on social transformation rather than reforms that return us to the normal or to the regular. So I thought her framing is quite useful, and whilst I used it more generally in the context of gender and COVID, I want to particularly apply it here in the context of labour market. Because I do believe that if you frame and gender the problem differently, that we get to understand a different nature of the problem. So to some degree, I think what we need to bring into the conversation more, and James reminded me in his presentation of the need to bring in the importance of knowing how different public services really are important in providing an underbelly of support to people in low paid and precarious employment. And if we don't have that in our understanding, then we don't sufficiently understand the barriers to employment that are there, and we don't understand the need to approach policy in quite a holistic way and from a whole welfare state perspective rather than just a labour market perspective. So that's one reason to try and reframe it. The other is, and you can see on the graph that I have in this, which was a pre-crisis graph, but this was the analysis in the National Economic Dialogue in July 2019. And what that analysis was trying to show was that the dark blue refers to the people who aren't framed in the present understanding of what the problem is. It's the nearly 600,000 people who are on a non-labour market related income support but of working age. So those on carers payments, lone parents payments, job seeker transition payments, disability allowance, the very broad range of working age payments that are not live register. And what my argument is that in framing the problem only about the live register, those on pandemic payments and those on temporary work subsidies, we've simply not brought with us into the problem framing the 600,000 people who are also dependent on income support and who also need extra income often through the labour market. So Philip mentioned this actually at the beginning in his introduction to today's conference, that we did have a huge problem before COVID-19. And my fear is that we are slightly forgetting this problem. So the graph that you see here has actually got the 600,000 workers inserted into the analysis of what the problem is. And it means our problem is much bigger than simply COVID-related job loss, which at its peak was 1.3 million. Because when we put in those extra people who are on working age welfare payments and dependent on the state for income, we actually saw at a peak that we had 1.8 million who were dependent on the state for some form or other of income. So in reframing the problem, we bring what are largely those women back into the picture. And I think when we have them in the picture, the return to normal becomes much more problematic and the need for transformation becomes much more obvious, because what we can tell in our analysis of the prior COVID normal was that it wasn't really fit for purpose for a significant number of people. Neither our labour market systems and our public employment services, nor our labour market and the degree to which it throws up about a third of its jobs being low paid, neither of them are fit for purpose. And I think there's a real paradox in the formal analysis, often depending on what are very positive evaluations of the normal and particularly of some of the labour market programmes and public employment services, and what in reality is often very poor qualitative assessment of those types of services and programmes from the perspective of the user. There seems to me to be a real mismatch between the formal evaluation and the street level talk of what these programmes are, and I'm quite curious about what the reality of that mismatch is. I think when we put gender and care back into the picture a little bit, that it forces us to relook at the mixture of enabling income compensation or regulatory control type policy mixes that we have. I think we have, in making sure that there are sanctions understood as part of our carrot and stick model of workforce activation, I think it omits the degree to which sanctions may be not part of the picture when it comes to gender, and particularly when there's care. So I think we need to look harder at what evidence for regulations or sanctions there actually is in Ireland. And I think we need to look harder at the evidence that people actually return to work in Ireland without sanctions, and the degree to which we overemphasise possibly the need for these conditionalities. I'm old enough that this is my third crisis, came out of the 1980s crisis, worked in the INOU, got my way through the previous 2008 crisis, and now moving into this third crisis. My understanding is that most people go back to work because they want to, because they need to get money, because there isn't enough in the income support system. And I've always wondered about the degree to which we've adopted a normative frame of sanctions in Ireland without possibly needing to. So what I want to argue, therefore, is not for a return to normal, but for a new welfare architecture that is capable of addressing the old problems alongside the new pandemic problems that are emerging. And I want to argue particularly that we need to bring gender into that frame for social transformation. And I think if we do that, it lends itself to a much wider understanding of what's needed. And yes, we need a labour market policy that's really driven by a very facilitative and enabling state, both at a national and local level, that really enables people to maximise how they can participate and flourish both in the labour market and in life. But what's really needed for those, and particularly for women, is that we use our income support system, and particularly individualised payments in an income support system, to enable people maximise their own capacity to participate, and that we see that as quite widely framed. I think one of the real challenges that we're not talking about in relation to the pandemic unemployment payment is it was very welcome that there was individualised payments available. But if we try and push these individualised payments back into what is a household means tested job seekers payment, I think women will suffer hugely in the fallout from that, and we will find economic inactivity of women increasing significantly. So I think there's a whole space there where we need to address the idea of an individual right to a welfare payment and individualised unemployment payments.
This was your 2-minute warning there, Mary. Perfect. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. I've muted you there, Mary. Hold on one sec. Oh, God. Sorry, Mary. Sorry about that. You were muted there for a second at the end there.
Oh, I say. Oh well, I ended by saying, individualised income supports are really important if we want to have a gendered understanding of what the problem is, but also access to universal basic services are clearly necessary, not only to enable those with precarious work to flourish and survive, but really we're entering into a stage where we may expect a perpetual crisis. That will be the new normal. If we look at climate change, if we look at what's coming out of just transition analysis and digitalisation and automation as well, we can expect workers and citizens to need much more underlying security in order to make the life transitions that they will need to do on a continual basis. So income supports and universal basic services need to be seen as a different type of floor that enables citizens to be enabled to make their own lives make sense in the context of continual change. So the need for social transformation is there. Thanks.
Yeah, I sort of question on my own at the start there. It was that initial chart you put up with the block of people sort of who haven't got the same kind of coverage in the weekly statistics in terms of people being. How do you think in terms of? I mean, I have followed quite closely the debate about universal credit in the UK and sort of how that started out as a way of sort of maybe destigmatizing certain forms of, it started out with some good intentions of destigmatizing certain forms of individual payments, and meaning that people in work and out of work were getting the same payment, just at different rates based on. Now that turned out to come with one of the most harshest sanctions regimes I think I've ever seen in a system. But do you think that kind of the sort of destigmatizing or sort of making certain welfare payments more transitional has any benefit?
No, I mean, there was work here done in 2010 on the idea of a single working age welfare payment, which was, you know, in the space that universal credit was in. I wouldn't be that hung up on needing to get rid of the contingent payments in Ireland. What I would be more concerned of is three things. One is that all people have a right to and are enabled to access the labour market supports that they do need if they want to access work. So I think that right to work is quite important in the middle of all that, but also that the income support and the underlying basic services are available to people who need them. Because it's all and well saying some people shouldn't be made work, and I agree with that, but not if they're just left in poverty for the whole of their lives without access to sufficient income or services. So I don't think it's a bang them all into the labour market or keep them all out of the labour market. I think it's a more complex problem that we're trying to solve. And I certainly think sanctions is at the answer to that problem.
One question I think came on there on the female labour market participation and childcare, and any thoughts on the best provision of those services?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one where the lessons from COVID offer us, you know, a way forward. We saw that the over-reliance on market-based provision of childcare really denies people, first of all, but also maybe denies the state the opportunity to really use childcare as an underlying service that enables the state to be flexible about how it needs childcare to operate. So I think it really points the way forward to a state-funded childcare infrastructure more than ever. And that needs to be part of that suite of universal basic services that could underpin people's participation in the labour market and in life more generally. Yeah.
Well, listen, look, I think we haven't gone scandalously over time. People should be able to chomp down some lunch before the next session, but it just leaves me to say thank you to all our panelists for very interesting presentations there, and from various aspects and points of view. And we will, if Paul, unless there's anything else you want to add in there.
Yeah, it was just for a bit of housekeeping, everyone. I'd echo Paul's remarks. Thank you for your presentations today. Everyone watching should see in the webinar chat, I've put in, we're going to recommence our next session, which is labour market evaluation and estimation at 12:55. So in the chat there, all these links are available in that attendee conference pack that you should have received. If you can't find that or you've misplaced that link, please copy and paste that Zoom link below. You also see the conference program attached. One thing that's emerged is in the few minutes before we begin the session, we have a private room going just for setup with the panelists. So if you see a notification saying effectively you've been put in a waiting room, you might refresh that as the session begins. So 12:55, refresh that. You should be able to go immediately into the room. So I'm just I will shut off this broadcast now and let everyone have lunch. So please, if you could rejoin us at 12:55, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.